The restaurant was buzzing with activity, the clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversation mixing together in a steady rhythm. It was the kind of place people came to celebrate small victories, catch up with friends, or simply enjoy a night out. The lighting was warm, the chairs comfortable, and the air smelled faintly of fresh bread and simmering sauces. Everyone seemed happy, except for one woman who had stormed in not long before. She moved quickly through the tables, scanning the restaurant with an expression that made it clear she wasn't in the mood to enjoy herself. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, each step announcing her presence. She stopped at a table near the center, pulled out her chair roughly, and sat down as if she owned the place. Her eyes darted around, impatient and critical, like she was already spotting problems everywhere. A waitress appeared almost instantly. She was young, but moved with a calm confidence that made her presence noticeable, even in the crowded room. Her apron was spotless, her uniform neat, and her voice gentle as she greeted the woman. "Good evening, ma'am. Welcome. Can I start you off with something to drink?" The customer barely glanced at her, waving her hand dismissively. "Just get me water." "And make it fast," she said, her tone sharp, the kind that made the waitress pause for just a moment before maintaining her composure. The waitress nodded and moved efficiently toward the counter. Even though she was calm, her coworkers had noticed the tension building. They had seen difficult customers before, but something about this one felt different. She wasn't just impatient. She seemed almost determined to make someone uncomfortable. Within minutes, the waitress returned with a glass of water, placing it gently in front of the woman. "Here you go, ma'am. Your server will be back shortly to take your order." The woman looked at the glass as if it were an insult. "Is this all? You can't even get a clean glass, right?" She snapped. Her voice carried across the table, and a few nearby diners turned their heads, sensing the brewing confrontation. The waitress did not respond immediately. She simply smiled politely and said, "I apologize if it isn't perfect. I'll get you another glass." But the customer was already growing more frustrated. "You people are useless. I come here expecting good service, and this is what I get?" She slammed her hand on the table, making the glass of water wobble dangerously. Other diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some tried to pretend they weren't watching, while others whispered quietly to their companions. The staff behind the counter exchanged nervous glances. They had rules about handling aggressive customers, but nothing in their training had prepared them for someone acting this boldly in front of everyone. The waitress returned again, carefully placing a new glass on the table. Her hands were steady, her expression calm, but inside she felt the familiar nervous flutter that came with dealing with someone so angry. "Here's a new glass, ma'am. Is there anything else I can get for you while you look at the menu?" The customer's eyes narrowed, scanning the menu as if it were a puzzle she had no intention of solving. "Yes, everything looks fine, except that your service is terrible. I shouldn't have to wait this long for a menu." She tossed the menu back onto the table, making it fall with a thud. The waitress took a deep breath and said softly, "I'm very sorry for the wait. I'll take your order right now." The customer's next words cut sharper. "No, I want to speak to the manager. Clearly, you're not capable of handling even the simplest tasks." By now, the restaurant had gone quieter. Conversations had slowed, the hum of activity interrupted by the tension at this single table. Other staff members had begun watching from a distance, unsure whether they should intervene. They didn't want to make things worse, but everyone knew the situation could escalate quickly. The waitress gestured politely toward the manager, who appeared from the back office. "The manager is here, ma'am," she said. "I'll let him help you." The manager approached, a tall man with a calm, professional demeanor. "Good evening, ma'am. I understand there's been some frustration. How can I assist you?" The customer didn't even look at him. Assist me? You need to fix the terrible service in this place. This girl here," she gestured toward the waitress, "can't even get a glass of water, right? This is unacceptable." The waitress remained quiet, listening as the accusations flew. She kept her hands folded in front of her, maintaining a composed expression despite the heat rising in her chest. The customer leaned forward, her voice rising. "Do you even know how to do your job? I've been waiting, and all I get is excuses. I've been to better restaurants where even the waitstaff knows how to act." Something inside the waitress snapped not out of anger, but out of a deep, controlled frustration that had been building for years. She had worked hard to get where she was, taking every job seriously, treating every customer with respect. And yet, here was someone treating her like she was invisible. The woman suddenly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She gestured wildly at the waitress, yelling over the murmurs of other diners. "This is ridiculous. I demand satisfaction." In a moment that seemed almost frozen, the customer grabbed at the waitress's apron. The fabric tore with a sharp rip that made everyone in the restaurant flinch. Gasps echoed through the room as the waitress's apron hung in tatters, a visible symbol of the customer's rage. The waitress stepped back, her calm still intact, but shock flashed across her face. She didn't push the woman away or shout. She simply held her hands close to her chest, trying to regain composure. Other diners stared, some horrified, others unable to look away. The customer, thinking she had won, waved her hands dramatically. "This is what happens when you hire incompetent people. I can't believe I even came here." She looked around at the silent witnesses, clearly proud of her public display. The waitress took a slow breath. She could feel the heat on her face, the sting of embarrassment, but she refused to let it show more than it already had. She straightened her back, her voice still soft but steady. "I apologize, ma'am. Please, let me get you another apron." The woman stared at her, confused by the lack of a proper meltdown. "Another apron? Are you kidding me?" The manager finally intervened, stepping between the two women. "Ma'am, that's enough. You cannot behave this way in our restaurant." The customer waved him off, as if he were invisible. "I demand an apology. I've been treated like a child, like I'm nothing." The staff behind the counter were tense, unsure if they should call security. Some diners began recording the incident on their phones, the kind of situation that could easily go viral. But the waitress remained calm, not flinching, not raising her voice. It was as if she had anticipated moments like this and learned to weather them without letting the storm hit her inside. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The customer continued to shout, pacing back and forth, gesturing wildly, clearly enjoying the attention. The restaurant had become quiet except for her, the normal rhythm replaced with a heavy tension. Despite the chaos, the waitress continued her work silently, checking tables, refilling water, attending to other customers with the same care she had before the incident. Her focus never wavered, which only seemed to irritate the customer more. "Are you ignoring me? Are you just standing there pretending nothing happened?" The waitress finally spoke in the same calm voice. "I am here to make sure all our guests are taken care of. I'm also waiting for you to speak with the manager so we can resolve this properly." The customer, taken aback by the polite tone, faltered for a moment, unsure how to respond. The tension in the room shifted slightly, though no one realized it yet. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the waitress had reclaimed a fraction of the control that the customer had tried to seize. The scene ended with the customer still yelling, the apron still torn, but the waitress standing firm, her composure unbroken, silently signaling that there was more to her than met the eye. And while the restaurant slowly returned to its usual hum, everyone who had witnessed the incident knew they had seen something unusual, a test of character in the middle of a normal evening, and a young woman facing it with quiet strength. The restaurant had slowly begun to settle after the incident with the torn apron, but the tension in the air was still thick. The customer remained standing near her table, arms crossed, clearly unhappy, and still muttering complaints under her breath. A few diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, trying to return to their meals, though some couldn't help sneaking glances at the unfolding scene. The waitress, however, continued moving through the restaurant as if nothing unusual had happened. She cleared empty plates, refilled water glasses, and offered gentle smiles to other guests. Her calm demeanor almost a contrast to the storm that had just passed at the table that her coworkers watched from a distance, whispering quietly to one another. Some were impressed, others worried. How is she staying so calm? One of them muttered. I don't know, another replied. If that happened to me, I'd have lost it. But the waitress remained composed, carrying herself with quiet dignity. She knew that responding with anger would only make the situation worse. The customer, still standing, crossed her arms tightly. Are you ignoring me on purpose? She demanded, her voice louder now, drawing more attention from nearby diners. She looked around the restaurant, expecting some form of support from the staff. Instead, she met polite but firm expressions from everyone, a subtle unity forming against her behavior. The waitress finally approached the table, her movements deliberate but calm. Ma'am, she said softly, I am here to help. If you would like to speak with the manager, he is ready to assist you. Otherwise, I can take your order now. The customer glared at her, clearly frustrated by the lack of emotional reaction. Take my order? She repeated sharply. Do you even know how to serve someone properly? The waitress nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. I am here to make sure you are taken care of. For a moment, the customer hesitated. She had expected fear, apology, maybe even tears. Instead, she found a quiet strength that she hadn't anticipated. She waved her hand dismissively. Forget it. I'll wait for the manager. While the customer waited, the manager returned from the back office. His calm presence immediately changed the energy around the table. He didn't scold the customer, nor did he raise his voice. He simply stood there, a steady and professional presence, waiting for her to speak. Good evening, he said, addressing the customer politely. I understand there has been some frustration. I'm here to help resolve the situation. The customer didn't look at him. This girl, she gestured toward the waitress, can't even get a glass of water right. And she tore my napkin and almost ruined my clothes with that apron. I demand an apology. The manager nodded slowly, taking it in without showing any anger. I understand your frustration, ma'am. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We want every guest to feel welcome and cared for here. The waitress stepped back slightly, giving the manager space to handle the conversation. She had done her part by remaining composed and professional, but she could feel the weight of the customer's anger lingering in the room. It wasn't just about the torn apron. It was about someone trying to assert dominance in a place where respect was expected. Other staff members had begun to regain their composure as well. They resumed their duties quietly, checking on other tables, refilling drinks, and serving meals, all while keeping an eye on the tense table in the center. They knew that if the situation escalated further, they would need to step in, but for now, the waitress's calm example seemed to prevent things from spiraling out of control. The customer, sensing that her usual tactics weren't working, changed her approach. She leaned closer to the manager, her voice dropping slightly. I don't care who she is. That girl humiliated me. I should be treated better than this. The manager remained composed, listening carefully. I hear you, ma'am, he said. No one here wants any guest to feel disrespected. We will make sure this matter is addressed. While the conversation continued, The waitress quietly adjusted her apron, now torn and uneven, and straightened her uniform. Her calmness had a subtle effect on the room. Diners who had been whispering to one another began returning to their meals, some offering discreet looks of support or admiration toward her. The customer, however, was still frustrated. She had expected to see someone intimidated, someone pleading or apologizing. Instead, she faced quiet confidence, a sense of dignity that she could not easily shake. She tried to regain control, gesturing with her hands and speaking loudly, but the energy had shifted. People were no longer captivated by her anger. They were noticing the grace of the young woman she had tried to humiliate. A few moments later, another staff member, a senior server, quietly approached the manager. "Should we call security?" he whispered. The manager shook his head. "Not yet. Let's see if we can resolve this calmly. She's testing us, but we don't need to escalate unnecessarily." Meanwhile, the waitress continued attending to other guests. She refilled a glass of water for an elderly couple, offered dessert menus to a table of friends celebrating a birthday, and smiled politely at everyone she passed. Her actions were simple, but they spoke volumes. She was not defined by the aggression directed at her. She had control over her own reactions, and that control gave her a quiet authority that was hard to ignore. The customer, frustrated by the lack of emotional response, tried one last tactic. She stood taller, placing her hands on the back of her chair, and announced loudly, "This is ridiculous. I've never been treated like this anywhere. I demand satisfaction immediately." At that moment, a hush seemed to fall over the restaurant. Diners paused mid-conversation, and even the kitchen staff peeked out from behind the pass-through window to see what would happen next. The waitress, standing nearby, remained composed. She did not flinch. She did not shout. She simply waited for the manager to respond. The manager spoke calmly, his voice measured. "Ma'am, we want every guest to feel respected. This kind of behavior is not acceptable in our restaurant, and we will make sure it is addressed. Please, let's resolve this without further disruption." The customer's face turned red, and for a brief moment, she seemed unsure how to respond. She had expected to dominate the situation with anger, but that tactic was no longer effective. The calmness and professionalism of the staff, especially the waitress, had neutralized her attempts to create chaos. The waitress quietly stepped closer to the table, her presence gentle but firm. "Ma'am," she said softly, "I am here to help. You can speak with the manager, or I can take your order if you prefer. Either way, we want to make sure you are taken care of." Her calm voice, combined with her composed demeanor, seemed to confuse the customer. She had expected confrontation, tears, or fear, but she found none. The energy around the table shifted subtly, and even the diners nearby began whispering, quietly among themselves, noticing the contrast between the young woman's grace and the customer's anger. After a moment, the customer finally sat down, still fuming, but clearly unsure how to continue. The manager nodded, giving a small, almost imperceptible smile of relief. The immediate crisis had been managed without further escalation, thanks in large part to the waitress's quiet strength. The rest of the evening continued with the staff maintaining their professional demeanor. Other customers received attentive service, and the busy restaurant gradually returned to its normal rhythm. The torn apron, once a symbol of humiliation, now seemed almost irrelevant. What mattered was how the waitress handled the situation, with dignity, patience, and respect for herself and others. By the end of the night, the waitress had completed her shifts, attended to every guest, and maintained her composure despite the earlier confrontation. The staff who had witnessed the incident spoke in hushed tones of admiration. They had learned something important. Sometimes strength is quiet, and dignity is more powerful than anger. And though the customer had tried to create a spectacle, She had underestimated the resilience and professionalism of someone she assumed was powerless. The waitress had shown that being calm, respectful, and firm could turn the situation around without raising her voice or responding with aggression. As the restaurant lights dimmed and the last guest left, the waitress took a moment to straighten her uniform and adjust her apron, still torn, but no longer a source of shame. She had faced humiliation, anger, and confrontation, yet she had remained herself graceful, composed, and strong. The events of that evening would stay with everyone who had witnessed them. It wasn't just a story of a torn apron or a difficult customer. It was a story about quiet strength, professionalism, and the power of remaining calm in the face of aggression. And while the customer had tried to assert dominance, the real lesson had been delivered by the young woman who refused to let anger dictate her actions. The restaurant had slowly returned to its usual rhythm after the earlier confrontation, but a quiet tension lingered in the air. Staff members were back to their duties, refilling water, clearing plates, and attending to guests, yet there was a sense that something unusual had happened that evening. The customers who had witnessed the incident were whispering quietly, sharing their thoughts about the confrontation and the composure of the young waitress, who had faced the angry woman without losing her calm. The waitress moved steadily among the tables, her torn apron still hanging unevenly around her waist. She refilled a water glass for an elderly couple, smiling gently as she did, then offered a dessert menu to a group of friends celebrating a birthday. Her actions were small, ordinary gestures of service, yet there was something about the way she carried herself, confident, composed, unshakable, that made people take notice. She had faced humiliation, anger, and confrontation, yet she continued her work as if nothing had happened. The customer who had caused the commotion sat quietly at her table now, her arms folded, her face flushed with embarrassment and frustration. She kept glancing at the waitress, as if trying to understand how someone could remain so composed under such circumstances. Her earlier confidence had faded, replaced by an uneasy curiosity. Meanwhile, the manager approached the young waitress, speaking quietly so the other staff members would not overhear. "You handled that very well," he said, his voice calm but sincere. "I know it wasn't easy, and you kept your composure. That took a lot of strength." The waitress nodded, her expression neutral but appreciative. "Thank you. I just wanted to make sure the guest was taken care of without causing more problems." The manager smiled faintly. "Sometimes the hardest thing is staying calm when someone is trying to provoke you. You did it well." The waitress returned to her duties, but she couldn't ignore the customer's gaze. The woman seemed unsettled, her earlier arrogance replaced by something like doubt. She had expected fear, tears, or anger from the waitress, but she had seen none. Instead, she had witnessed quiet confidence, professionalism, and dignity, the kind of strength that didn't demand attention, but commanded respect all the same as the evening went on. The customer tried to regain some sense of control. She called the manager over again, insisting on speaking about the incident. The manager listened patiently, nodding occasionally, and offered solutions in a calm, measured tone. Yet the customer seemed increasingly aware that her usual tactics, yelling, demanding, humiliating, were ineffective here. The waitress's calm, composed presence had changed the dynamic, even if the customer didn't fully realize it yet. Meanwhile, the waitress continued her rounds, attending to other guests with care and attention. She smiled, refilled drinks, and offered dessert recommendations, all while keeping an eye on the tense table without making it obvious. Her calm energy seemed to ripple through the restaurant. Guests who had witnessed the earlier scene felt reassured. The staff who had been worried were inspired. Even the customer, though frustrated, could not escape the subtle shift in the room. It was then that a senior staff member quietly approached the manager. "Do you think she should stay?" he whispered. I mean, the guest is still upset. Should we do something more? The manager shook his head. No, let's give her a moment. She's learning something important, whether she realizes it or not. And the waitress? She's not just an employee. She handles situations like this because she understands how to maintain control. The waitress, overhearing part of the conversation without turning, continued her work, unaware of just how much her colleagues had noticed her composure. She had learned long ago that power and authority were not always obvious. Sometimes the person who seemed quiet or ordinary held more influence than anyone realized. Tonight, she was showing that principle in action. The customer, growing restless, attempted to speak with the waitress again, but her attempts were met with the same calm demeanor. I am here to help, the waitress said softly, but if you wish to discuss the matter further, the manager is available. The woman's frustration was evident. She had thought she could intimidate the young waitress, but that strategy had failed. Now, faced with silence instead of submission, she didn't know how to respond. The energy in the restaurant had shifted. Where before all eyes had been on her outburst, they were now quietly observing the waitress, the calm, composed figure who had refused to be shaken not at that moment. A subtle but noticeable change occurred. The manager, seeing an opportunity to address the situation without escalating it further, stepped closer to the table. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm and deliberate, "I'd like to clarify something about our staff here. The young woman you have been speaking to is not just a server. She has responsibilities beyond what you have seen tonight." The customer looked up, confusion flashing across her face. "What do you mean?" she demanded. The manager continued, his tone still measured. "She is closely involved in the operations of this restaurant. She knows how things work at every level. She ensures that our guests are treated with respect, and she has authority over how staff conduct themselves." The woman blinked, trying to process the information. "Are you saying she's in charge?" The manager nodded. "She is. She works here to understand every part of the business, not just to serve, but to lead. She sets standards, trains staff, and ensures quality. The apron you tore was worn by someone with responsibility and authority, even if it looked like a uniform." The customer's face went pale. For the first time that evening, she realized she had made a serious mistake. She had assumed she could humiliate someone who appeared powerless, not knowing that the person she had targeted held significant authority. Her earlier confidence crumbled as the implication sank in. The waitress remained calm throughout the revelation. She adjusted her apron slightly, still torn, and offered a small, polite nod. She had learned long ago that humility and patience could speak louder than anger or confrontation. Tonight, she had demonstrated that principle perfectly. Other diners, who had been quietly observing, began to whisper among themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others offered discreet smiles of admiration. The atmosphere in the restaurant had changed completely. The power dynamic had shifted, not with loud words or dramatic gestures, but through quiet composure and professional integrity. The customer, now realizing the magnitude of her mistake, tried to speak, but the manager gently intervened. "I believe we have addressed the situation," he said. "We want all guests to feel respected, and we also want our staff to be treated with dignity. I think it's time to move forward." The woman sat back, speechless. She had expected to dominate the scene with anger, but she had been outmaneuvered not by force or intimidation, but by calmness, patience, and quiet authority. She had learned an important lesson in humility, though she might not admit it out loud. Meanwhile, the waitress returned to her duties, her calm presence reassuring everyone around her. She refilled water glasses, cleared plates, and attended to new guests arriving for the evening service. Her actions were simple, routine, yet they carried a weight that only those paying attention could notice. She had faced humiliation anger, and public confrontation. Yet she had emerged unshaken, demonstrating strength without aggression. The staff, now inspired, worked with renewed focus. They had seen how professionalism and patience could turn a difficult situation into a moment of respect and learning. Even the younger servers, who had been nervous about handling aggressive customers, took note of the quiet authority the waitress had displayed. As the night continued, the customer finally left the restaurant, still flustered and embarrassed, though outwardly composed. She had realized that her attempts to humiliate someone had backfired spectacularly. The restaurant returned to its normal rhythm, the earlier tension gradually fading as diners resumed their conversations and meals. The waitress, now alone briefly behind the counter, took a moment to adjust her torn apron. She looked around at the quiet, orderly dining room and allowed herself a small, satisfied sigh. She had faced a challenge, one that could have shaken anyone, but she had maintained her composure, demonstrated her authority, and protected the dignity of herself and her staff. In the quiet that followed, she reflected on what had happened. Power was not always obvious. Authority did not always announce itself. And sometimes the person who appeared ordinary, quiet, or even vulnerable held more influence than anyone realized. Tonight had been a reminder of that truth, not just for the customers, but for everyone in the restaurant who had witnessed the events. The young waitress straightened her uniform, still torn, and prepared for the final part of her evening. She had handled one of the most difficult moments of her career with grace, patience, and quiet strength. And while the incident with the customer would likely be remembered by many, it would also serve as a lesson. Assumptions about power, respect, and authority can be dangerously misleading. The torn apron, once a symbol of humiliation, had now become a quiet emblem of resilience and dignity. And as she moved through the restaurant, serving her guests with the same care and attention as always, it was clear to anyone paying attention that she was far more than she appeared to be. She was a leader, a professional, and someone whose quiet strength had changed the course of an evening. The restaurant had settled into a calm rhythm once again, but there was a subtle sense of anticipation in the air. Some of the diners who had witnessed the earlier incident still glanced toward the young waitress, curiosity and admiration mingling on their faces. Even the staff seemed a little more attentive than usual, as if quietly acknowledging the strength she had shown. The customer, who had caused so much chaos earlier, sat at her table with a mix of anger and confusion. She had expected to feel triumphant, to have dominated someone she assumed was powerless, but instead she had been confronted with calm authority and quiet control. She tried to regain composure, straightening her posture and fixing her expression. But there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. The manager approached the table again, this time with a different tone, still calm, but with a clear sense that the next words were important. "Ma'am," he said politely, "I think there's something you should know. The young woman you've been speaking to, she is not just a server here. She has responsibilities that go far beyond what you have seen tonight." The customer frowned, leaning back slightly. "Responsibilities? What do you mean?" The manager gestured toward the waitress, who had been standing quietly nearby, attending to other guests. "She is one of the owners of this restaurant," he explained. "She spends time working with staff in every position, so she understands how things operate. She ensures that every guest is treated well and that the restaurant runs smoothly. The apron you tore was worn by someone who holds authority and responsibility, someone who has dedicated herself to this place." The customer's jaw went slack. Her earlier confidence faltered, replaced by disbelief. She had humiliated someone she assumed had no power, and now she was confronted with the reality that the person she had targeted was in fact the owner. The young waitress stepped forward slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. She adjusted her torn apron, which now seemed less like a symbol of humiliation and more like a mark of resilience. Her eyes met the customer's, steady and unflinching. "I am responsible for this restaurant and everyone who works here," she said quietly. "I also ensure that our guests are treated with respect, just as our staff expects to be treated with dignity. What happened tonight was unnecessary, and it was not acceptable." The room seemed to hold its breath. Other diners who had witnessed the confrontation leaned forward slightly in their seats, intrigued by the revelation. Some of the staff behind the counter straightened, a subtle pride evident in their expressions. The young waitress had handled a difficult, potentially humiliating situation with professionalism, and now the truth of her authority was clear to everyone. The customer looked around the room, suddenly aware of the eyes on her. She had created a spectacle, expecting to dominate with anger, but now she found herself exposed. Her earlier sense of control had vanished, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that she had misjudged the situation completely. I didn't know," the woman stammered, trying to recover some sense of composure. "I thought you were just a waitress." The waitress nodded slightly. "Appearances can be deceiving," she said calmly. "What matters is how we treat one another, not assumptions based on roles or uniforms. Respect is something everyone deserves, regardless of position." A few diners murmured quietly in agreement, and the manager added, "We want our guests to feel welcome, but we also expect that everyone's staff and visitors alike acts with courtesy. This restaurant values dignity and professionalism, and tonight that principle has been tested." The customer's face flushed with embarrassment. She had assumed power over someone she thought was below her, only to discover that her assumptions were completely wrong. She had tried to humiliate someone who had more authority than she could have imagined, and now there was no easy way to undo what had happened. The young waitress continued, her voice calm but firm. "I understand that mistakes happen. What I hope you take from this is that we all have a responsibility to treat others with respect, no matter the situation. Actions have consequences, and words can carry more weight than we sometimes realize." For the first time that evening, the customer's tone softened, though she was still clearly uncomfortable. I suppose I got carried away," she admitted. "I didn't realize." The waitress nodded once, acknowledging her admission without condescension. "It's important to recognize our mistakes and learn from them. Tonight is a reminder that everyone, regardless of role, deserves respect and kindness." The other diners, who had been quietly observing the interaction, seemed to relax. Some whispered quietly, others exchanged subtle smiles, recognizing the lesson unfolding before them. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted again, this time from tension to reflection. The focus was no longer on the angry outburst, but on the calm authority and professionalism displayed by the young woman who had been underestimated. The manager spoke again, reinforcing the point. "This restaurant thrives because of the dedication of our staff, and because we believe in fairness and respect. What happened tonight is a reminder for all of us, guests and employees alike, about the importance of treating each other with consideration." The customer, now fully aware of her misjudgment, nodded silently. She had been humbled, though not harshly, by the revelation of the waitress's true role. The young waitress, having remained calm and composed throughout the confrontation, had not only maintained her dignity, but had also educated the customer in a subtle and powerful way. The staff, inspired by the young waitress's actions, returned to their duties with renewed focus. They cleared tables, refilled drinks, and assisted new guests with energy and professionalism. The torn apron, once a symbol of humiliation, now seemed to represent resilience, patience, and a quiet strength that comes from knowing one's worth. The young waitress moved through the restaurant methodically, checking on tables, offering dessert menus, and engaging with guests warmly. She had handled a potentially humiliating situation with grace, demonstrating that authority does not always require loud words or dramatic gestures. Quiet confidence, patience, and respect could be far more effective and far more powerful than anger or intimidation. The customer finally stood to leave, her demeanor subdued. She had come expecting to dominate, to assert control over someone she assumed had no power. Instead, she had been confronted with calm authority, quiet strength, and professionalism. She realized that her actions had consequences, and that assumptions about others could lead to embarrassing mistakes. Before leaving, the customer turned slightly toward the young waitress, her expression a mix of embarrassment and reluctant respect. I'm sorry," she said softly. The waitress nodded, accepting the apology without judgment. "Thank you," she replied calmly. "I hope this experience reminds you that respect is important for everyone, no matter their role." As the woman left the restaurant, the atmosphere seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The diners who had witnessed the incident returned to their meals, their conversations slowly resuming. The staff behind the counter exchanged quiet smiles, proud of how the situation had been handled. The young waitress returned to her routine, attending to guests with the same care and attention she had shown all evening. In the quiet moments that followed, the manager approached her again. "You handled that exceptionally well," he said sincerely. Not everyone could have stayed so calm under that pressure. The waitress adjusted her apron and nodded. "It was a difficult situation, but I wanted to show that professionalism and patience are more powerful than anger or intimidation. Sometimes people just need to see calmness and respect to understand their mistakes." The manager smiled. "You've reminded all of us, staff and guests alike, that dignity matters. That's something people will remember tonight." The evening continued, the restaurant returning fully to its normal rhythm. Guests laughed, clinked glasses, and enjoyed their meals, while the staff carried out their duties efficiently and gracefully. The torn apron, once a source of potential shame, had become a quiet symbol of resilience, patience, and quiet authority. The young waitress, now fully recognized for her role and her composure, moved through the restaurant with quiet confidence. She had turned what could have been a humiliating encounter into a lesson in professionalism, respect, and strength. Her actions had not only resolved the conflict, but had left a lasting impression on the staff, the guests, and even the customer who had tried to create chaos. By the end of the night, the young waitress stood briefly behind the counter, surveying the restaurant. Everything was in order, the guests had been taken care of, and the staff had been inspired by her example. She straightened her torn apron, no longer a symbol of embarrassment, but a reminder that strength comes from calmness, dignity, and a quiet confidence to handle difficult moments with grace. The story of the torn apron, the angry customer, and the quiet, composed waitress would remain in the memories of everyone who had witnessed it. It was not a story about anger, humiliation, or confrontation. It was a story about authority, resilience, and the power of calmness in the face of aggression. It was a lesson in how true strength does not always announce itself loudly, but can quietly command respect and admiration. And as the restaurant lights dimmed and the last guests left, the young waitress, the real owner of the establishment, reflected on what had happened. She had faced a challenge with dignity, patience, and professionalism. She had maintained her composure under pressure, demonstrated quiet authority, and taught an important lesson about respect and humility. The torn apron had survived the evening, a silent witness to what had transpired. It was no longer just a piece of fabric. It was a symbol of resilience, strength, and quiet leadership. And as she prepared to close the restaurant for the night, she knew that the lesson had been delivered not through anger, confrontation, or drama, but through calmness, patience, and professionalism. The restaurant had grown quiet after the earlier chaos, the last few diners finishing their meals and preparing to leave. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and warm dishes, a comforting scent that contrasted sharply with the tension from just hours before. The young waitress moved calmly among the tables, tidying up, refilling glasses, and offering polite smiles to those who remained. She had regained control of the space, and her quiet authority was evident to everyone present. Even the staff seemed to breathe easier now. They had been nervous, unsure how the situation with the angry customer would end. They had watched, wide-eyed, as a guest screamed, tore an apron, and seemed determined to humiliate one of their own. But they had also watched the waitress remain calm, professional, and collected throughout. She had been their anchor, and they had learned from her example without even realizing it at first. The customer, the source of so much disruption, was still seated near the exit, though now she looked subdued. Her earlier confidence had vanished entirely. The revelation that the young waitress was the actual owner of the restaurant had humbled her more than she wanted to admit. She had expected to dominate someone she assumed was powerless, only to discover that she had misjudged the entire situation. The manager approached the customer one last time, his tone gentle but firm. "Ma'am, I hope this experience helps you reflect on how we treat others. Respect is important in every interaction, whether you're at a restaurant or elsewhere." The woman's voice was soft, hesitant, and tinged with embarrassment. I didn't realize. I thought she was just a waitress. I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand." The waitress, standing nearby, nodded politely. "I understand that people make mistakes," she said calmly. "What matters is recognizing them and learning from the experience. Everyone deserves respect, no matter their role." The customer swallowed hard. She had come in full of anger, expecting to dominate, humiliate, and assert control. Instead, she had been confronted with patience, professionalism, and quiet authority. For the first time that evening, she realized that her behavior had been inappropriate and that her assumptions had caused unnecessary conflict. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quiet now. "I didn't mean to cause so much trouble." The waitress gave a small nod, accepting the apology without judgment. "Thank you. That means a lot. I hope this is a lesson you carry forward." With that, the customer stood and left the restaurant, her earlier arrogance replaced by humility. She walked out quietly, her footsteps soft, leaving behind a space that now felt calm, orderly, and full of respect. The staff watched her go, understanding that the evening had been a lesson not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed the incident. The young waitress returned to her work behind the counter, straightening the torn apron and organizing the dishes. The restaurant felt peaceful once again. The earlier confrontation, which could have been a source of embarrassment or chaos, had transformed into a moment of learning, reflection, and quiet triumph. One of the senior staff members approached her quietly. "You handled that incredibly well," he said sincerely. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone stay so calm under pressure. You showed everyone here what professionalism really looks like." The waitress smiled faintly, adjusting her apron. "I just wanted to make sure the guest was treated well and that our staff maintained dignity. It's not about being impressive. It's about doing the right thing." Another staff member, younger and clearly inspired, spoke up. "I learned a lot tonight. I saw how staying calm and respectful can actually change a situation. I want to do that too from now on." The waitress nodded. "That's the lesson. People notice more than you think, and how you respond matters. Even when someone is aggressive, responding with patience and professionalism can turn things around." As the restaurant emptied and the staff finished their final tasks, the young waitress took a moment to reflect on the events of the evening. She had faced a situation that could have shaken anyone angry, aggressive customer who had acted without thinking. But she had stayed calm, composed, and dignified. Her actions had protected the staff, taught a lesson to the customer, and demonstrated the importance of quiet authority. The torn apron, once a symbol of conflict, now seemed almost heroic. It had witnessed an entire lesson in patience, respect, and professionalism. She touched the fabric gently, knowing that it had been through a lot. Just like the evening itself, the manager approached again, quietly this time, and spoke softly. "You handled that better than I could have imagined. You showed everyone, staff, guests, and even the customer, what true leadership looks like. Calm, fair, and firm without ever being aggressive. You've earned respect tonight." The waitress smiled, grateful but modest. "I just did what I thought was right. I wanted to show that respect works both ways." People notice that more than they think. The staff gathered briefly before closing, discussing the night's events. They spoke quietly, sharing what they had learned, expressing admiration for the young waitress, and reflecting on how they would handle similar situations in the future. The air was full of respect, pride, and a sense of shared understanding. Hours later, as the restaurant finally closed for the night, the young waitress stood alone behind the counter, surveying the empty dining room. The lights cast a warm glow over the tables and chairs, creating a sense of calm after the storm. She straightened her apron one last time, knowing that the torn fabric had become a symbol of resilience, patience, and quiet leadership. It was a night that everyone who had witnessed it would remember. Not because of anger or drama, but because of calm strength, dignity, and the power of professionalism. The customer had been humbled, the staff had been inspired, and the restaurant itself had been a stage for a lesson in respect that would not be forgotten. The young waitress allowed herself a small sigh of satisfaction. She had turned a potentially humiliating situation into an opportunity for learning and growth. She had maintained composure, protected her staff, and shown that quiet authority could speak louder than any outburst. As she prepared to leave, she reflected on the lessons of the evening. Power is not always obvious, she thought. Authority does not always announce itself. And sometimes the person who seems quiet, ordinary, or even vulnerable holds more strength and influence than anyone realizes. The torn apron would remain, a silent reminder of the night's events. It had witnessed confrontation, humility, and the quiet triumph of patience and professionalism. And as she locked the doors and stepped out into the cool night air, she knew that the lessons learned tonight would resonate with everyone who had been there, not because of anger or drama, but because of quiet strength, respect, and dignity. The young waitress, the real owner of the restaurant, walked home with a sense of accomplishment. She had faced a challenge, stood her ground, and handled the situation with grace. She had protected her staff, taught a valuable lesson, and demonstrated that respect and patience are often more powerful than force or aggression. By the next day, word of the incident had spread quietly among regular patrons. People who had witnessed the event shared the story, not the chaos, but the lesson in composure, professionalism, and quiet leadership. The young waitress became an example for both staff and guests, showing that calm authority, patience, and dignity could turn difficult situations into opportunities for growth and understanding. The torn apron, now cleaned, but still showing subtle signs of wear, became a quiet emblem of resilience. It reminded everyone in the restaurant, and anyone who heard the story, that assumptions can be misleading. Humility is important, and strength often lies in calmness, patience, and quiet confidence. For the young waitress, the night had reinforced a truth she already knew. Respect is earned through actions, not appearances. True authority does not need to be loud or aggressive. It is felt, seen, and recognized through patience, fairness, and dignity. And as she finally rested that night, she reflected on the story she had lived, the angry customer, the torn apron, the lessons in humility and respect. She had faced a test of character, and emerged not only unscathed, but stronger. Her quiet strength leaving an impression on everyone who had been there. The restaurant would continue to thrive, the staff inspired by what they had witnessed, and the guests reminded that respect and dignity matter in every interaction. The story of the torn apron and the young, composed owner would remain, not as a tale of anger or humiliation, but as a story of quiet authority, resilience, and the lasting power of professionalism and respect.